What if some of the most nourishing, most remarkable vegetables simply vanished from our plates centuries ago, disappearing not through extinction, but through neglect, fashion, and the slow tide of agricultural change? Today, when we think of vegetables, we imagine a narrow cast of familiar characters: carrots, potatoes, spinach, lettuce. But the medieval table was filled with a broader chorus of flavors, plants that were once essential for both peasants and kings, and yet now linger only in the footnotes of old manuscripts. 15 such forgotten superfoods once thrived in the fields, gardens, and monastery plots of Europe. They were not just food, they were survival tools, flavor experiments, and sometimes even cultural symbols. These were crops that could withstand bitter winters, herbs that healed, roots that mimicked meat and fish, and fruits so strange that they demanded patience to eat. Together, they tell a story not just of vanished flavors, but of the ingenuity and resilience of people who lived without the safety nets of refrigeration, greenhouses, or global trade. Imagine the medieval farmer, bent back from toil, walking his strip of land with the same hope we carry to supermarkets today, that there will be enough. Yet unlike us, he had no imported bananas, no tomatoes from across oceans, no sugar to sweeten bitter herbs. He relied on what could grow in his soil, in his climate, and in his season. And what grew was often astonishing in its adaptability. Vegetables we are about to rediscover were not luxury goods for the few, though some did grace the tables of nobility. They were lifelines during famine years, nutritional bridges during the hungry gap of spring, and humble staples that, in their time, carried as much weight as rice does in Asia or maize in the Americas. Their disappearance is a mystery of history, sometimes deliberate, sometimes accidental, often a casualty of changing tastes and economies. The first forgotten treasure of this medieval pantry was called skirret. To modern ears, the name sounds almost alien, yet for centuries, these slender, sweet white roots were cultivated with devotion. Unlike the carrots we know today, which demanded constant care, skirret was the gardener's dream, once planted. It spread underground like a quiet insurance policy, producing food almost without effort. To medieval farmers, skirret was like money in the bank, an investment that grew beneath the soil. Unseen but dependable, its flavor, too, made it a star. Sweeter than parsnips, subtler than carrots, skirret was beloved in both rustic stews and noble banquets. Royal gardens grew it by command, and ordinary villagers roasted it by firelight in the depths of winter. It was, in many ways, Europe's potato before the potato arrived from the New World. And yet, in the slow march of progress, skirret slipped away, cast aside by crops that promised bigger harvests, faster growth, or longer shelf life. Begin with skirret is to begin with a question. How could something so reliable, so delicious, and so vital vanish almost entirely from our diets? Asterisk among the forgotten treasures of the medieval pantry, none enjoyed such universal admiration as skirret. To describe it simply as a root vegetable is to undersell it. In its time, skirret was praised as both a delicacy and a lifeline, a plant capable of feeding a village, yet refined enough to command a place at royal feasts. Skirret's greatest strength lay in its nature. It was perennial, hardy, and forgiving. Once planted, the roots spread and multiplied underground, quietly creating reserves of nourishment without requiring constant attention. Where modern carrots demanded neat rows, frequent weeding, and careful tending, skirret thrived in quiet neglect. Medieval farmers cherished this reliability, likening it to a secret savings account buried beneath the soil, always there when the fields failed or the seasons turned cruel. The taste was what made skirret unforgettable. Descriptions in 5th, 10th, and 16th century herbals compare its sweetness to parsnips, but with a lighter, almost honey-like undertone. Some even said it was finer than carrots, whose bright orange flesh we now take for granted, but which, in medieval times, was not yet the dominant crop. Skirret's thin white roots roasted beautifully, softened into fragrant stews, and even appeared in pies, offering a natural sweetness in an age when sugar was an exotic luxury reserved for the very rich. It is no surprise, then, that Skirret developed a reputation at court. Records from Tudor England and beyond show it graced noble kitchens, demanded by lords and ladies who delighted in its delicate flavor. Some sources claim it was cultivated in palace gardens, specifically to please royal appetites, making it, in a sense, one of the first celebrity vegetables of European history. Yet beyond the glittering halls of nobility, peasants valued it no less. In poor households, skirret was called the comfort of the table, a food that endured when other crops withered in the cold. Its versatility only strengthened its appeal. Young roots could be boiled or fried, the older ones stewed, mashed, or even baked into pastries. Medieval cookbooks praised it for its adaptability. Skirret was a vegetable that could play many roles in the kitchen, from side dish to main course, from savory to sweet. Some food historians have even argued that skirret was a precursor to the role potatoes would later take on in Europe, serving as the flexible staple around which entire meals could be built. And yet, despite its royal endorsement, despite its resilience, skirret gradually disappeared. Why? Part of the answer lies in the agricultural revolutions that swept Europe after the 16th century. Farmers began to favor crops that were larger, faster growing, and more uniform. Potatoes, carrots, and turnips took center stage. Skirret, with its thinner roots that branched unevenly and required careful cleaning, was pushed aside. What once made it charming to cooks became, in an era of efficiency, a flaw. There's a quiet irony in this disappearance. In an age where superfoods are marketed with glossy labels and bold claims, skirret was the genuine article centuries ago. Hearty, sweet, nourishing, versatile. It fed kings and commoners alike. And yet today, most people would not even recognize the name. Perhaps skirret's story reminds us that progress in farming is not always a straight ascent toward better food. Sometimes, in the quest for speed and convenience, we abandon treasures that sustain generations. Skirret, the once royal root, is proof that history's soil still hides flavors waiting to be rediscovered. If skirret was the dependable, quietly multiplying root, Alexander's was its opposite. Bold, ambitious, and everywhere. This plant did not confine itself to neat garden rows. It spread, uninvited, across the landscape, coastal cliffs, roadside ditches, abandoned fields, yet wherever it appeared, it brought value. In a way, Alexander's was the medieval version of a friendly vagabond, difficult to control, but impossible not to appreciate. Its journey into medieval Europe began centuries earlier. Roman legions carried seeds of Alexander's with them as they marched across Britain and beyond, planting them deliberately in some places, accidentally in others. The Romans valued it for its vigor, for its ability to flourish in poor soils and windy coasts, and for its versatility in the kitchen. By the Middle Ages, the plant had become thoroughly woven into the diet of Northern Europe, thriving in monastery gardens, village plots, and the wild alike. What made Alexander's remarkable was its total edibility. Every part of the plant could be used. The young green shoots, tender and crisp, were eaten like celery. Leaves, though unusual in flavor, lent a sharp, pleasant taste to soups and stews, somewhere between parsley and celery. Blossoms appeared in bright yellow umbels that added color and subtle spice to salads. Even the seeds, small and aromatic, could be ground and used as a pepper substitute in a time when pepper itself was worth its weight in gold. The roots, though less common, were also edible, adding yet another dimension to its usefulness. 1. 14th century English text even praised Alexander's for its role in sustaining coastal communities, where salt winds made other vegetables scarce. Here, Alexander's grew wild, requiring no care, no tending. Its very presence was a gift. Bees swarmed to its blossoms, bringing pollination to nearby crops. Herbalists noted its medicinal qualities as well, using it to treat digestive issues, coughs, and infections. In short, Alexander's was more than a vegetable, it was a kind of botanical freelancer, contributing wherever it turned up. And yet, its abundance may have been its undoing. Alexander's very vigor made it seem common, even weedy. By the 1700s, it was increasingly replaced by celery, whose cleaner taste and more delicate stalks suited changing fashions in cooking. Celery offered refinement. Alexander's, by contrast, seemed coarse and old-fashioned. Once banished from gardens, it lingered only on the edges of roads and cliffs. Dismissed as a weed. Today, few recognize it for what it once was. People walk past Alexander's in Britain and parts of Europe without realizing they are passing a food once prized by both Romans and medieval cooks. Its bright yellow blossoms nod in the wind, overlooked reminders of a forgotten menu. The story of Alexander's carries with it a small irony. In our time, we celebrate foraged foods, wild greens gathered by chefs to give dishes rustic authenticity. Alexander's fits that bill perfectly, an abundant, edible, resilient plant growing free for the taking, yet it remains ignored. In a sense, Alexander's is still waiting to be rediscovered, as it waited for Rome, as it waited for the monasteries, as it waited in the wild. The plant is still here. Only we have forgotten. From the unruly boldness of Alexander's, we turn to a humbler figure, good King Henry, a plant as steadfast as its name suggests. Unlike the vegetable that sprawled over roadsides and cliffs, good King Henry had a more dignified, if quieter, presence. It was the loyal servant of medieval gardens, returning year after year with the patience of a faithful retainer. Its name carries a mystery. No chronicler has explained why it was called Good King Henry. Perhaps it was a reference to a forgotten folk tale, or to some benevolent ruler now lost to time. Some regions knew it by another title, All Good, a name that speaks volumes. In an age when famine was never far away, when the failure of one harvest could mean desperation, a plant that reliably reappeared each spring truly was all good. A blessing of the soil, the plant was as undemanding as they come. Farmers and gardeners noted that once established, it grew with little effort, sprouting on its own each year, hardy against weather and neglect alike. If plants could apply for work, good King Henry's resume would have highlighted one thing above all else: reliability. Nutrition was another strength. Long before the word superfood existed, this plant would have earned the title. It was richer in iron than spinach, and provided generous amounts of vitamin C, a nutrient desperately needed in medieval diets. In the lean, hungry months of early spring, when winter stores ran low and new crops had yet to grow, good King Henry pushed tender shoots through the soil, offering food when it was most needed. In more ways than one, it was a bridge between scarcity and survival. Medieval kitchens made full use of it. The young shoots were eaten like asparagus, tender and green. Mature leaves cooked down like spinach, hearty enough to form the basis of a meal. Even the flower buds, small and clustered, were gathered and prepared like miniature broccoli. It was, in essence, a three-in-one vegetable, a plant that adapted itself to whatever role was needed in the kitchen. For peasants, that flexibility was priceless. For cooks, it was a quiet miracle. Beyond the kitchen, good King Henry found a place in folk medicine. Herbalists used its leaves for poultices to heal wounds, and its roots brewed into teas that served as gentle laxatives or remedies for stomach complaints. In an age when medicine was little more than observation and tradition, any plant with multiple uses earned reverence. And yet, despite its virtues, good King Henry faded from prominence as agriculture grew more commercial. By the 18th and 19th centuries, farming shifted toward crops that promised higher yields and market value. The humble perennial was too slow, too common, too unprofitable. Gardens became tidier, fields more efficient, and one by one, the old standbys like good King Henry were pushed aside. Today, few remember it. Fewer still cultivate it. But in medieval Europe, good King Henry was more than a green. It was a quiet symbol of endurance, of nourishment at the edge of starvation, of the dependable generosity of the earth. It is hard not to see in its story a reflection of countless forgotten lives from the past, ordinary, essential, and loyal, yet overlooked by history's spotlight. Asterisk of all the medieval vegetables, few carried such a peculiar reputation as salsify. To the eye, it looked humble, long, thin roots, sometimes gnarled, sometimes smooth, their dark skins concealing pale flesh. But to the tongue, it offered a surprise that made it famous. When cooked, salsify tasted uncannily like oysters. This odd quality gave it enormous value in an age when diet was shaped not only by the seasons, but also by religion. For medieval Christians, especially those living under the strict rhythms of Catholic observance, meat and fish were forbidden on certain days, most notably during Lent, yet hunger and desire do not yield easily to rules. Here, salsify provided a perfect solution, a vegetable that masqueraded as seafood, satisfying the palate while keeping the conscience clear. Monastery records from the 1400s describe beds of salsify cultivated for precisely this reason. In cloistered gardens where prayer dictated the hours, rows of these roots served as substitutes for fish, brought up from the earth rather than the sea. It was a vegetable that bridged faith and appetite, offering the taste of indulgence without breaking the rules of abstinence. There were two main kinds known in medieval Europe: white salsify and black salsify. Both produced long taproots that had to be peeled before eating, a reminder not to judge a book by its cover. For beneath their unassuming, sometimes ugly exterior lay a delicacy. Prepared properly, roasted in butter or simmered in broths, the roots softened into something creamy, rich, and savory. In noble kitchens it was praised as a gourmet curiosity. In monastic refectories, it was welcomed as a loophole granted by nature itself. Salsify's strengths went beyond flavor. In a world without refrigeration, storage was survival. This root could remain in the ground through the freezing months, dug up fresh as needed. Even when harvested, it kept for weeks, sometimes months, without spoiling. For families staring down long winters, this endurance made it invaluable. It was not just a food. It was a guarantee. And yet salsify too fell victim to the unforgiving logic of modern farming. Its growth was slow compared to faster crops like potatoes and carrots. Its thin roots, uneven and sometimes difficult to clean, did not appeal to markets demanding uniformity. Its unusual flavor, once a marvel, was increasingly seen as odd. As Europe shifted toward crops that could feed armies and fuel cities, salsify slipped quietly into obscurity. There is something almost poetic in its fate. A plant once treasured for imitating the ocean's bounty, once vital to religious practice and seasonal survival, now barely lingers at the edge of culinary memory. If skirret was the king's root and good King Henry the poor man's comfort, salsify was the impostor artist, a humble root that dared to taste like the sea. If salsify astonished medieval people by pretending to be oysters, then the meddler challenged them with something stranger still, a fruit that had to rot before it could be eaten. To the modern eye, the meddler is hardly appealing, small, round, brown, with a puckered open end that reveals its seeds. Freshly picked, it is rock-hard and astringent, so bitter it cannot be eaten. And yet, once medieval gardeners learned its secret, the meddler became a prized delicacy. The secret was blooding a patient, almost alchemical process of controlled decay. Picked in late autumn, the fruit was laid out on straw or stored in cool cellars, left for weeks until its flesh softened and its skin browned. What had been harsh and inedible transformed into something entirely different, a sweet, spiced pulp with the texture of cinnamon apple puree. For people accustomed to winter diets of grains and salted meats, this was nothing short of miraculous. It was not simply the taste, but also the timing that made the meddler precious. Few fruits ripened so late in the year. When gardens stood barren and orchards empty, the medlar lingered on the branch. After bledding, it could be stored into the depths of winter, offering one of the last fresh sweets before spring's return. In the cold, dark months, it was a reminder of nature's strange generosity. Medieval cooks used medlars in many ways. They made tarts and jellies, brewed them into wines, and even mashed them into a kind of rustic custard. Recipes from the 13th century praise their flavor, not just as dessert, but also as an ingredient in hearty dishes where sweetness balanced salt and spice. The fruit's unique character inspired comparisons that were sometimes admiring, sometimes crude. Its unusual open-bottom shape earned it a host of ribald nicknames, some too indecent for polite company, though one common comparison was to a certain human anatomy. Medieval humor was earthy, and the medlar's appearance made it an easy target, yet mockery did not lessen its value. The medlar was a fruit of patience and transformation. It taught that not everything good could be eaten immediately, that some things demanded waiting. To eat a medlar was to accept that decay could produce sweetness, that time itself could be an ingredient. In a society deeply attuned to the cycles of nature, this carried a resonance beyond the table. So why did it vanish? The answer lies in the rise of modern agriculture and consumer expectation. Markets began to favor fruits that looked perfect on display and could be eaten at once. Apples, pears, and later bananas filled baskets with instant appeal. Who would choose a wrinkled browning fruit that required weeks of waiting? The medlar, once beloved for its oddness, became a casualty of impatience. Today, most people have never tasted one. The fruit that delighted medieval lords and peasants alike now survives in scattered hedgerows and old country orchards, its memory preserved only in literature and forgotten recipes. To rediscover it is to rediscover a different relationship with food, one where beauty and perfection mattered less than transformation, where flavor was worth waiting for. The medlar is proof that medieval people accepted complexity in their diet, even celebrated it. What they prized we reject. And in that rejection, we have lost not only a fruit, but a lesson in patience. Not every medieval food was carefully planted, tended, and harvested. Some arrived uninvited, spreading across fields, gardens, and pathways, as if to remind farmers that nature provides on its own terms. Among these unasked-for gifts was chickweed, a plant so common it was impossible to ignore, yet so nourishing it earned a place at both the peasant's hearth and the nobleman's table. To the casual eye, chickweed looked insignificant, a creeping little green with delicate white star-shaped flowers. But its persistence was unmatched. It grew in every soil, sprouted in every season above freezing, and produced seeds in such abundance that once it appeared, it never left. Farmers could weed their gardens endlessly, but chickweed always returned like the uninvited guest who shows up at every banquet, only to bring a dish so good no one dares send them away. Medieval people were not fooled by its humble appearance. They recognized chickweed as a free and dependable food source, one that could be gathered fresh almost year-round. Its tender leaves added greenery to meals even in the depths of winter, when most plants had long withered. Nutritionally, it was astonishing. Ounce for ounce, fresh chickweed contains about 7 times more vitamin C than oranges. In an era when scurvy and malnutrition haunted communities, this unassuming plant was a literal lifesaver. Peasants collected it for daily soups and porridges, but records also show that chickweed found its way into noble kitchens. During the bleak months when gardens were bare, even lords welcomed the freshness it brought to the table. It was one of those rare foods that crossed class lines, binding the hungry and the wealthy alike in quiet gratitude. Herbalists, too, valued chickweed. They steeped its leaves into teas to reduce fever, brewed poultices to soothe skin irritations, and praised its cooling properties as a treatment for inflammation. In manuscripts, chickweed often appears not just as food, But as a medicine proof of how blurred those categories were in medieval thought, what healed could also nourish. What nourished could also heal. Yet, in the march of progress, chickweed's reputation faltered. As modern agriculture advanced, efficiency and control became the watchwords. Chickweed, impossible to restrain, was branded a weed. Herbicides declared war on it. Nutritional science, which should have celebrated its richness, largely ignored it. And so, what was once a treasured, freely available superfood has been cast aside as an agricultural nuisance. There is a quiet lesson here. Medieval people, without laboratories or supplements, saw worth where we see weeds. They accepted that nourishment could be gathered, not just grown. Today, when supermarkets present food in sterile abundance, we forget that survival once depended on noticing the gifts sprouting in ditches and hedgerows. Chickweed, the humble vitamin hero, may have been small, but it was mighty, and it is still with us, waiting for recognition. In the tapestry of medieval vegetables, some plants were cherished for their flavor, others for their reliability. And then there was scorzonera, a root that entered kitchens wrapped in folklore. Its very name carried drama. Derived from the Italian scorzone, meaning venomous snake, scorzonera was long believed to protect against snake bites. Early herbalists swore that eating the root or brewing it into tea could counter venom, making it as much a talisman as a vegetable. Of course, science would later prove such claims false. But in the Middle Ages, when snakes lurked in fields and superstition shaped medicine, the belief was enough to make scorzonera popular. Yet superstition was only the beginning. Beneath its rough, black skin lay pale, tender flesh that revealed a flavor subtler and sweeter than its close cousin, black salsify. Notes of asparagus and nuts made it versatile, pleasant, and highly valued in cooking. Monks in monasteries grew scorzonera diligently. In a world where religious fasts restricted meat and fish, the root's satisfying flavor offered nourishment and variety. Records from the 1500s show scorzonera listed among the essential plants in monastic gardens, prized not just for food, but also for supposed medicinal properties. Herbal manuals described scorzonera tea as a remedy for bad blood and stomach troubles, reflecting the medieval conviction that plants were keys to balancing the body's humors. But scorzonera's true strength was its storage power. Harvested in autumn, the roots could be buried in sand inside cool cellars, where they stayed fresh for months, sometimes until the following summer. Few other vegetables provided such long-lasting security. In an age when winter scarcity could starve villages, scorzonera offered peace of mind. A cellar filled with its roots was as good as coin in the bank. Like many forgotten foods, its decline came not from failure but from progress. With the rise of refrigeration and year-round trade, Europeans no longer relied on vegetables that could endure months underground. Fresh produce became available in every season. In that new world of abundance, scorzonera's practical advantage lost its meaning. And as markets demanded uniform, easily recognizable crops, its long, dark roots, gnarled and strange, became less appealing. There's an irony in scorzonera's story. A vegetable once believed to ward off death eventually died in memory itself, replaced by flashier, faster-growing staples. Yet in its time, scorzonera was more than food. It was reassurance in the cellar, a guardian in the garden, a root that symbolized resilience. If Skirt was the quiet treasure and the medlar the fruit of patience, scorzonera was the medieval vegetable of survival and superstition. To pull one from the soil was not just to harvest a meal, but to draw up centuries of belief, flavor, and the comfort of knowing tomorrow's hunger might be kept at bay. Not every medieval vegetable was what it seemed. Some carried names that confused even those who grew them. Among these was the Welsh onion, which, contrary to its title, was neither from Wales nor a true onion. Instead, it was a perennial green. Imported from East Asia, most likely through the winding arteries of medieval trade that carried spices, silks, and seeds across continents. By the 1200s, it had made its way into European gardens, where it quietly earned a reputation for dependability. What set the Welsh onion apart was its perennial nature. Unlike ordinary onions that had to be replanted each season, the Welsh onion returned year after year. Left in the soil, it multiplied steadily, forming generous clumps that could be divided and replanted indefinitely. One medieval gardener claimed that a single plant could feed a family for 10 years, if tended and divided properly. In an era when seeds were precious and crop failures frequent, this kind of self-renewing bounty was priceless. But while it shared a family name with the onion, its role in the kitchen was different. The Welsh onion never formed large bulbs underground. Instead, it offered abundant green shoots above the soil. Hollow and crisp, these shoots flavored soups, stews, and salads throughout the year, their sharp freshness cutting through the heaviness of salted meats and thick porridges. For peasants, they were a cheap way to season food. For nobles, they were a fresh garnish in winter's bleak months. The Welsh onion's greatest gift, however, was its winter hardiness. In much of Europe, when gardens lay frozen and barren, these onions remained green, pushing through frost and snow. At a time when scurvy and vitamin deficiency threatened health during long winters, the shoots provided vital nutrients. In a sense, the Welsh onion was a bridge across the hungry season, a quiet green flame burning in the cold. And yet, despite its resilience, the plant's identity worked against it. Not truly Welsh, not truly an onion, it seemed to live in a permanent state of confusion. Farmers eventually shifted toward larger bulb onions that stored better and could be sold more easily in growing markets. In the language of commerce, bigger and simpler won the day. The Welsh onion, though more practical in the long term, became a relic. Still, one might argue that its story is symbolic. Here was a plant that didn't quite fit a category, yet endured because of its usefulness. For medieval people, it was enough that it grew, enough that it nourished. Today, in a world obsessed with labels and uniformity, perhaps the Welsh onion reminds us that not everything of value must fit neatly into a box or a bulb. Asterisk, if the Welsh onion was a misfit by name, Fat Hen was a misfit by reputation. Today, most gardeners know it only as a weed, something to be pulled up and discarded. Yet in the Middle Ages, Fat Hen was one of the most important wild foods in Europe. A humble plant that often stood between families and starvation, it required no cultivation. Fat Hen appeared on its own, scattering across waste ground, garden borders, and field edges. Medieval farmers could not have stopped it if they tried, and many didn't. Instead, they learned to harvest it, to see value where others saw nuisance. Its resilience was unmatched. It grew in poor soils, in nearly every season, and in staggering abundance. In a world where one failed harvest could mean hunger, this stubborn plant was a gift. Nutritionally, Fat Hen was a powerhouse. Modern studies have revealed what medieval people sensed instinctively. It contained more protein than cabbage, more iron than spinach, and more calcium than kale. If medieval nutritionists had existed, Fat Hen would have been labeled a superfood. Centuries before the term was coined, it was eaten by peasants in times of plenty and famine alike, boiled like spinach, mixed into stews, or served fresh in simple salads. Its seeds were equally valuable. Ground into flour, they offered sustenance during the harshest famines. Archaeological digs across Europe have uncovered Fat Hen seeds in countless medieval waste pits, evidence that it was not merely a stopgap but a regular part of the diet. Even chickens benefited. The plant got its common name from its role as a cheap, abundant poultry feed that plumped hens and improved egg yield. But the medieval poor knew what later generations forgot. If it was good enough for the chickens, it was good enough for them. Folk medicine praised it as well. Herbalists prescribed its leaves as poultices for burns, and decoctions of its seeds for digestive troubles. It was not glamorous, but it was reliable food, medicine, and animal fodder all in one dot. So how did this unassuming lifesaver vanish from the human diet? The answer lies in the rise of commercial agriculture. As farming became more systematized, plants that volunteered freely were labeled weeds, competitors to the carefully chosen crops of market gardens. Fat hen, once a friend, was recast as an enemy. Herbicides and prejudice did the rest, erasing it from kitchens even as it continued to grow defiantly in fields. And yet, its story has not ended. Foragers and food historians have begun to look again at this overlooked green, recognizing in it the quiet wisdom of the medieval table. In an era that celebrates kale smoothies and exotic seeds flown halfway across the world, perhaps the true marvel has been under our feet all along. Fat hen was not glamorous. It did not appear on royal menus or inspire poetry. But in its simplicity, it performed a service more noble than any. It kept people alive. And that is why it deserves to be remembered, not as a weed, but as the weed that fed generations. Some forgotten plants slip quietly from the kitchen. Others vanish with a sense of disbelief. Lovage belongs to the latter. It was once so central to medieval cooking that one wonders how on earth it disappeared at all. To taste, it is to meet celery in an exaggerated form, sharper, more aromatic. A flavor turned up to 10. In fact, if celery had gone to the gym, studied herbal medicine, and picked up a flair for drama, it would have become lovage. Its history stretches deep. The Romans carried lovage seeds with them as they conquered Europe, sowing them wherever they settled. Centuries later, medieval monks followed their lead, ensuring that every monastery garden contained a sturdy lovage plant. For them, it was both food and medicine, two categories that were rarely separated in those days. The plant's oils aided digestion, reduced bloating, and eased kidney complaints. Records from the 13th century describe lovage tea as a household remedy for troubles of the stomach. But the kitchen was where lovage truly shone. Its leaves could transform an ordinary pot of broth into something heady and complex. Medieval cooks used sprigs in stews, scattered dried leaves over meat, and ground the seeds into bread dough for spice. Even the roots were eaten, boiled like parsnips. Most surprisingly of all, the hollow stems were candied in sugar, turning this robust herb into a sweet treat, a medieval version of candied ginger. Its vigor made it a gardener's dream. Lovage was a perennial giant, often rising over 6 feet tall, with feathery green leaves that returned each spring, no matter the winter's severity. A single plant could flavor meals for decades, demanding little in return but a patch of soil. It is not hard to imagine medieval gardeners looking at it with quiet satisfaction, marveling at how so much flavor came from such little effort. And yet, this culinary titan faded. Why? The answer lies partly in shifting tastes. As global trade opened Europe to new flavors, black pepper, cinnamon, nutmeg lovage seemed rustic, even overpowering. By the early modern period, milder herbs like parsley and celery were in fashion, and lovage began to seem old-fashioned. Its boldness, once a virtue, became a flaw. By the 18th century, it lingered only in scattered cottage gardens and monastery plots. Remembered mostly by herbalists. The disappearance of lovage is one of history's quieter mysteries. Imagine a plant that flavors everything, survives for decades, and heals the stomach, yet we stopped growing it. The medieval cook, if transported into our kitchens today, might shake their head and ask if we had lost our senses. Perhaps we had. Lovage's story is not only about food, but about memory and taste. It shows how easily even the most useful plants can vanish when fashions change. What one generation sees as indispensable, another dismisses as outdated. And so, a plant that once flavored soups and cured ailments now lingers on the margins of memory, a reminder that culinary history is not a straight line of progress, but a series of losses and rediscoveries. If lovage faded because it was too bold, then corn salad nearly vanished because it was misunderstood. Its very name has caused centuries of confusion. When modern readers hear corn salad, they imagine kernels of maize tossed into a bowl. But in medieval Europe, corn referred to grain in general: wheat, barley, rye. And it was in those harvested grain fields that corn salad thrived, sprouting in autumn after the reaping, carpeting the bare soil with tender rosettes of green tubia. Medieval farmers, this uninvited arrival was not a nuisance, but a gift. Corn salad's small spoon-shaped leaves provided a rare luxury, fresh greens during the coldest months of the year. Long after other vegetables had disappeared from gardens, it remained mild and slightly nutty in flavor, free of the bitterness common to other wild herbs. For peasants who endured long winters of salted meat and coarse bread, it was a welcome touch of freshness. For nobles, it was a delicacy that appeared at feasts precisely because it was rare and seasonal. Its nutritional power was another hidden treasure. Modern analysis has revealed that corn salad contains 3 times more omega-3 fatty acids than iceberg lettuce, along with significant amounts of iron and vitamin C. In an age when scurvy was a constant specter, these little leaves provided a quiet defense. Without anyone realizing, corn salad was keeping communities healthier than they knew. And yet, despite its value, corn salad never quite managed to escape its branding problem. With a name tied to cornfields rather than kitchens, it often seemed more weed than vegetable. It lacked the dramatic presence of lovage or the exotic allure of spices arriving from far-off lands. It was modest, overlooked like the quiet child in a crowded hall who turns out to have the most interesting stories if only anyone listened. Still, for those who knew its worth, corn salad was indispensable. Monastic gardens often left patches of it untouched, knowing the leaves would sprout just when other foods were gone. Peasant families gathered it for everyday meals, while wealthy households praised it as a winter luxury. In every case, it was a reminder that the land itself provided, even when the farmer's hand was still. Its decline came with the march of commercial agriculture. As lettuces were bred into larger, longer-lasting varieties, corn salad seemed small, delicate, and inconvenient. Markets favored vegetables that could be shipped, stacked, and stored. Corn salad's gentle leaves wilted too quickly, and so it slipped quietly from prominence, surviving mainly in rural corners where old traditions lingered. And yet, the plant endures. Known today in some places as lamb's lettuce, it remains a favorite of foragers and a secret treasure among gardeners who prize its resilience. Corn salad's story is a reminder that sometimes the most nourishing foods are not those that dominate markets, but those that endure quietly in the margins. In the Middle Ages, corn salad was not misunderstood. It was appreciated for exactly what it was, a green flame of life in the dark of winter. It is only we, in our rush for uniformity and convenience, who forgot to listen to what it offered. Asterisk. If corn salad's tragedy was being too modest, tansy's downfall was the opposite. It was simply too much. Bold, brash, almost overwhelming. Tansy was the medieval herb that demanded attention. With its fern-like leaves and bright yellow button-shaped flowers, it stood out in the garden. And in the kitchen, its flavor was equally impossible to ignore: a strange mixture of bitter, spicy, and slightly sweet notes, so complex that modern chemical analysis has identified more than 40 distinct compounds in its leaves. For medieval cooks, this intensity was a virtue. Tansy was the seasoning of celebrations, appearing in recipes both savory and sweet. One of the most famous was tansy pudding, a springtime dish made with chopped leaves mixed into eggs, cream, sugar, and breadcrumbs, then fried into a rich cake. The taste was sharp, distinctive, unlike anything else. Cheese was sometimes flavored with tansy. Ales were brewed with it for special occasions. It was the herb that turned an ordinary meal into something memorable. But tansy had a practical side as well. Its strong compounds acted as a natural preservative, slowing the spoilage of meats and baked goods in an age without refrigeration. In this sense, it was more than flavor, it was protection. Its very strength was life-extending. Medicine, too, claimed tansy. Herbalists brewed it into teas for fevers, stomach troubles, and even intestinal worms. Monastery gardens nearly always included it, not only for its medicinal uses, but also because its pungent scent repelled flies and insects. Some households planted tansy near doors and windows, believing it kept pests and illness alike at bay. In both kitchen and apothecary, it was indispensable. And yet, boldness has its risks. To many medieval palates, tansy's intensity was exciting. To later generations, it became overpowering. As culinary tastes shifted toward milder herbs like parsley and thyme, tansy seemed too strong, too bitter, too archaic. By the early modern era, it was remembered less as a kitchen staple and more as an old remedy tucked away in herbals rather than cookbooks. Its powerful oils, once celebrated, even came to be treated with caution. Today, tansy lingers mainly as an ornamental plant, its golden flowers nodding in gardens where few realize the role it once played in shaping medieval cuisine. To taste, it now is to encounter the medieval palate in its rawest form, bolder, less fearful of bitterness, more willing to embrace extremes. If parsley is a whisper, tansy was a shout. The story of tansy is more than the story of a herb. It is a reminder of how tastes themselves evolve. What one century cannot live without, another finds unbearable. And so tansy, the all-cap seasoning of the Middle Ages, slipped into history loud, vivid, and unforgettable, even in its absence. Asterisk, not all medieval foods came from fields or gardens. Some clung to the edges of the land itself, thriving where few other plants could survive. Along the salty coasts of northern Europe grew a rugged green known as sea kale, a plant that embodied resilience, generosity, and quiet usefulness. To many, it was simply a wild shrub scattered across dunes and shingle beaches. To those who recognized its value, it was a gift of the shore. Sea kale was remarkable for its ability to grow in the poorest soil, sand, salt, wind-battered cliffsides. Where other crops shriveled, it flourished. Medieval communities living by the sea relied on it, not just as a vegetable, but as a form of protection against scurvy and malnutrition. Long before citrus fruits became known in northern Europe, kale provided vitamin C at levels 6 times higher than lemons. For fishing villages isolated from fertile farmland, it was not merely a plant, it was survival. The plant offered food in 2 distinct forms. In early spring, its blanched shoots were harvested and eaten like asparagus, tender, pale, and mildly sweet. Later in the season, its mature leaves could be cooked like cabbage, hearty and filling. In both forms, it offered nourishment when it was most needed. Families who lived along the coasts could gather it freely, turning the overlooked margins of the land into a pantry. And yet, despite this bounty, sea kale never achieved the fame of other medieval crops. Perhaps it was because it grew wild, outside the ordered rows of the garden, and therefore lacked the prestige of cultivated vegetables. Perhaps it was simply too common, too easy to ignore. Like chickweed inland, sea kale was food that cost nothing, and food that costs nothing is often undervalued. Its decline was not sudden, but gradual. As trade expanded, other vegetables filled the winter gap, and as farming became more centralized, wild greens were dismissed as old-fashioned. By the modern era, sea kale was largely forgotten, its usefulness buried under the tide of improved crops. Ironically, it was reintroduced in the 18th and 19th centuries by curious gardeners who treated it as a fashionable novelty, forcing it under pots to produce tender blanched shoots for the table, much like asparagus. What coastal peasants once gathered freely, aristocrats later cultivated at expense. Sea kale's story is a quiet parable. The value of resilience is often seen only in hindsight. For medieval people, it was a dependable gift from the sea, a vegetable that grew without tending, nourished without fail, and reminded them that survival sometimes came from the edges of the map. For us, it is a reminder of how much abundance lies hidden in places we overlook. In the medieval kitchen, sea kale was not celebrated with fanfare or royal banquets. But when hunger pressed close and winter stretched long, it was there. And in its quiet way, it deserves to be remembered as one of the true treasures of the coast. Few medieval plants had as strange and conflicted a reputation as woad. For centuries, it was prized not primarily as food, but as color. From its broad green leaves, a vivid blue dye could be extracted, one so valuable that it clothed kings, tinted manuscripts, and painted warriors. Before indigo reached Europe from overseas, woad was the source of blue. Without it, medieval clothing would have been a far duller affair. But woad was not only about textiles. In its earliest stages of growth, before the dye compounds developed, the young leaves were edible. Medieval farmers gathered them in spring, using them in salads or soups. Their flavor was mild, with a slight peppery kick, similar to mustard greens. For peasants eager for fresh greenery after long winters, this was a welcome gift. It meant that a crop planted for profit could also sustain the household. Yet woad came with a dark side, the dye-making process. Extracting blue required fermenting the leaves, a method that released a stench so foul that governments intervened. In some towns, royal decrees banned woad processing within city limits, pushing the smelly work to the outskirts. Chroniclers complained that the odor clung to clothes, streets, even the air itself. To live near a woad workshop was to endure what one writer described as the very breath of the devil's kitchen. Still, its economic power was undeniable. Woad fields stretched across parts of England, France, and Germany, fueling trade and wealth. Merchants grew rich, monasteries filled their coffers, and armies marched beneath banners dyed from its leaves. It was a plant that shaped economies and identities. To medieval eyes, it was a symbol of prosperity and pride, though. Perhaps less so for those who lived downwind of a dye pit. In time, however, woad lost its crown. By the 16th century, indigo from India and the Americas began to arrive in Europe. It was richer in color, easier to transport, and required less land to produce. Woad growers fought back fiercely. Some even convinced governments to ban indigo to protect their trade, but the tide could not be stopped. Indigo eclipsed woad, and fields once blue with flowers turned to other crops. As its economic importance faded, so too did its role as food. Its young leaves, once casually tossed into peasant stews, were forgotten. Woad became a relic of industry, remembered only for the dye that once made Europe blue. Today, it is a curiosity, sometimes revived by historical reenactors or artisanal dyers, but rarely recognized as something once eaten. Woad's story is one of duality, food and fabric, nourishment and commerce, freshness and foul stench. It reminds us that medieval plants were not confined to neat categories. A leaf could clothe as well as feed. A crop could enrich the soil, the body, and the treasury alike. In its blue depths, woad carried the contradictions of its age, both beautiful and ugly, essential and expendable. If woad suffered from an identity crisis, the turnip suffered from neglect of its very body. For centuries, Europeans treated the turnip root as a staple of peasant life, but overlooked its other half, the leaves. To medieval farmers and cooks, however, those turnip greens were as valuable, sometimes more so, than the root itself. It is easy to see why. The roots were bulky, storable, dependable, but the greens offered something rarer, immediate, concentrated nutrition. Compared ounce for ounce, the leafy tops contained 4 times more calcium, 3 times more vitamin A, and twice the protein of the roots. For families enduring the long winter, These greens were medicine as much as food, keeping bones strong and bodies healthy when fresh produce was scarce. Medieval peasants understood this well. They carefully harvested the outer leaves through the growing season, making sure not to damage the root developing beneath. In this way, one plant gave twice, first its leaves, then its bulb. The greens found their way into soups and stews, where their slightly peppery flavor lifted otherwise bland porridges of grain. In some villages, they were even eaten raw in rough salads, tossed with chickweed or corn salad for added freshness. The nobility, too, ate turnip greens, though often as part of elaborate dishes rather than simple fare. Cookbooks from the 14th and 15th centuries record recipes that blend the leaves with spices, herbs, and broths, proof that even in grand kitchens, their worth was acknowledged. Yet unlike asparagus or skirret, turnip greens were never considered glamorous. They were practical, filling, reliable, the workhorse of the vegetable world. Their medicinal uses also deserve note. Herbalists recommended boiled turnip greens as a mild treatment for chest congestion, while the juices were sometimes mixed with honey to soothe sore throats. In folk practice, the plant was seen as warming and fortifying, a green that carried strength from the soil to the body. So why did they fade from memory? Part of the answer lies in commercial agriculture. As markets expanded, vegetables were increasingly judged by what could be harvested, stored, and sold. Roots traveled well. Leafy greens wilted quickly. Over time, farmers emphasized the turnip bulb, while the greens were discarded or fed to animals. Consumers came to see them as byproducts rather than primary food. The knowledge of their value slipped away. There's a certain tragedy in this. In our age, where kale and spinach are exalted as health foods, the humble turnip greens, richer in nutrients than either, are rarely recognized. What medieval peasants knew instinctively, we have forgotten: that the true gift of a turnip lay not only underground, but above it as well. Turnip greens remind us that history's table was fuller than ours. We may pride ourselves on abundance, but in reality, we live on a narrower diet, trimmed of the overlooked parts that once nourished entire communities. In remembering them, we recover not just a food, but a way of seeing wholeness in the plants we grow. Asterisk from the royal root skirret to the humble turnip greens, from the oyster-flavored salsify to the pungent boldness of tansy, we have wandered through a garden of forgotten abundance. These 15 medieval plants, once so familiar to peasants and nobles alike, now linger only as footnotes in manuscripts, or as wild growth along roadsides that few recognize. Yet in their time, they were lifelines. They nourished people through famine and frost. They offered nutrition in forms that modern science now confirms were extraordinary: iron richer than spinach, vitamin C stronger than oranges, calcium beyond kale. They carried flavors we no longer know: sweetness from roots that never reached a market stall, sharpness from herbs too bold for today's tastes, delicacies that required patience, like the medlar softening into sweetness as it rotted into perfection. These plants also carried meaning beyond the table. Woad clothed armies in blue, its leaves painting the very identity of peoples. Lovage flavored not only soups but also the remedies of monks. Chickweed and fat hen proved that even weeds could save lives if only we had the humility to harvest them. The medieval world did not separate food, medicine, and survival so neatly. They were threads of the same tapestry, woven through necessity and tradition. And then they vanished. Some faded because they were too slow for commercial farming. Some were cast aside as weeds in the new order of agriculture. Others simply lost to fashion. Celery replaced Alexander's. Lettuce replaced corn salad. Parsley muted tansy. What once seemed indispensable became out of place in the new palette of modern Europe. It is tempting to see this as progress, after all. Today's supermarkets dazzle with abundance, their shelves stacked with produce from every corner of the globe. But abundance can also be a narrowing. In chasing uniformity, speed, and visual perfection, we have lost variety, resilience, and perhaps a little wisdom. The medieval farmer, bent in his fields, knew dozens of edible plants we would pass by without a glance. The medieval cook, stirring a pot in a smoky kitchen, understood flavors and textures we have long forgotten. To rediscover these vegetables is not merely to indulge curiosity. It is to recover a way of life attuned to survival, patience, and resourcefulness. It is to remember that food was not always easy, that eating once carried with it the drama of the seasons, the risk of scarcity, and the creativity of making do with what nature gave freely. Perhaps, too, there is something poetic in their disappearance. These forgotten crops are like echoes of voices fading through time, whispers of people who lived closer to the earth, who understood hunger and gratitude more intimately than most of us do today. To revive them, even in memory, is to honor that resilience, and maybe, just maybe, we can taste them again. Skirret can still be grown. Alexander's still blooms yellow on coastal roadsides. Sea kale still pushes through sand. Fat hen and chickweed still scatter themselves wherever they please. They are not gone, they are waiting. Waiting for us to notice them once more, and to remember that history's pantry was never empty, only overlooked. The medieval table may be centuries behind us, but its lessons remain. That survival depends on resilience, that nourishment hides in the overlooked, and that sometimes the greatest treasures are the ones already at our feet.